these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Okay, back to my favorite topic, energy and energy reliability, the trade-offs with energy reliability and the rush to renewables and green energy, the transition, all of it, what it means for energy markets, what it means for investments. That's not always something we talk about on this podcast. Really the business side of it, outside of the politics. Now they're, of course, inextricable from each other, but we don't always talk about the financing of energy, how that works, which countries are doing what. And so I want to bring on Arjun Murti today. He's got a great background in this, making sense of this energy transition, what kind of lessons we've learned. Really interesting background, 30 years on Wall Street, doing equity research as an equity research analyst on the global energy sector, bulk of his career at Goldman Sachs. It goes on and on and on. You worked at ClearPath, which is an organization I'm associated with as well. A great kind of conservative climate organization, rational environmentalism, as I call it. You publish, I guess, a column or whatever you would call it on Substack called Super Spiked. It's a newsletter that takes aim at messy energy transition era and the clash of energy, commodity, and equity markets with energy and climate policy. Well, it's a mouthful. Anyway, it's a really good energy Substack newsletter. So in case anyone's interested in that. So Arjun, thanks for being on.
Representative, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
So it's always curious, where do we begin? There's a lot of topics we want to hit here. What can you tell us about the current market when it comes to energy, but I guess specifically oil and gas? Just being from Houston, that's my first question is, how do you, when you're giving advice to investors, what are you telling them about the future of oil and gas?
Well, part of the reason why I started this Substack Super Spiked was, as the name implies, this energy transition era, we're on track for, in my opinion, a worst of all worlds, where the environmental goals, which is often the quote rush to transition, are not on track to be met. And in the meantime, you're disincentivizing much needed investment in traditional oil and gas. And you end up with this worst of all worlds where, for folks who prioritize the climate, I prioritize energy availability, affordability, reliability for all, ideally with an improving environmental footprint, but you got to provide people energy. And when you are taking people's energy away, when you're trying to disincentivize just some forms of energy for whatever reason, I think you end up nowhere. You end up with people poor, people not getting access to energy prices spiking. And then I really question whether we're on track to change that greenhouse gas trajectory when it's this sort of divisive, we got to be either or about these kind of things. And all of that motivated me to create this Substack.
And you're at a company called Veriton?
Veriton, that's right.
Yeah. So you guys provide data and analysis and to that effect on how to, but I agree with everything you just said, but so then how do you solve the problem where the money is just not flowing to baseload energy? And that's an issue in Texas when we had the big freeze, and there's a lot of blame going around, but in the end, I think the problem is really simple. We have increasing investments in intermittent energy, being wind, and everybody's like, oh, wind is great and it's cheap and there's so much of it. I'm like, yeah, but it's still intermittent. And when weather gets very severe, like really hot or really cold, it tends to kill the wind. So you have to still have baseload energy, and there has been a verifiable de-investment in gas, in coal, certainly in nuclear, across Texas. And so the mix just changes. Well, because demand is going up. And so that piece of the pie, even if if you keep the same number of gas plants, but their piece of the pie is getting smaller, and that's a problem. When we're not, obviously there's some things we can do at the policy level to change that, to change those dynamics. Those are kind of obvious, actually. I'm curious at the private level, you know, keeping government out of it. Like what within the private sector, within the investment world, why has there been less and less money going into more reliable forms of energy?
And I think, first of all, I agree with everything you just said. It starts with the private sector. So from 2011 to 2020, it was a tough period for traditional energy. Their profitability was poor. The return on capital, a measure of profitability for companies, was 0% over a decade. I mean, zero is, I don't think you have to be a Wall Street person to know a 0% profitability is a low number. And so investors fled the sector, went from 15% of the S&P 500, a major portion of the market, to the trough was 2%. And so the overwhelming reason investors said, stop wasting my money, oil and gas companies, give it all back to us in dividends, don't invest. And I'd say that has been the starting point. It's then been made worse by a lot of the virtue signaling around ESG and some of the policies out there. But it starts with poor profitability was the original culprit for low investment.
And okay, so and why was there poor profitability in that era, in that decade? Like, I don't, I can come up with guesses, but what's the simple answer?
In a nutshell, overinvestment in shale and over optimism about what kind of oil price, what kind of returns you get. And so companies thought they were generating 30, 50, 100% rates of return on these individual shale wells. By the time you added up some of the less successful wells, the infrastructure costs, the pipeline costs, all these other expenses, the profitability actually netted out to 0 to 5%, depending on the company, and kind of 0% for the sector. And that was at $50 oil. Now, since the trough of COVID, in the last 2 years, profitability has improved a lot. We're back to kind of 20% type returns on capital, significantly better. Yet investors and the CapEx has been slow to come back. And I think that's in part people saying it's only been 1 year of better times. So let's wait and see if you can sustain this. But you've also had here some of the policy constraints, some of the ESG constraints also weighing on investors saying, well, I don't know if oil and gas is going to be around. So if I'm unsure, let me avoid this sector that I remember for the previous 10 years did quite poorly, even if the last year was somewhat better.
Yeah, great for consumers, it seems, during those years, right? It was notoriously
It's been a
low
godsend
gas
for consumers, a godsend, absolutely.
And inflation, and probably largely responsible for the kind of the, what would you call it? The inflation or the lack of inflation mystery over the last couple of decades. Obviously, that's changed in the last couple of years. What do you make of all that? I mean, you're a financial analyst, because that you ask economists about, are we in a new era of inflation where we're just not as worried about it as we used to be? That was the case before 2021 and before COVID. That's obviously not the case now. But there was never a great theory put forth as to why that might be the case. And could it have been partly due to the energy sector and the fact that we were getting continuously low energy inputs into the economic system?
Well, so on the one hand, I was critical of oil and gas companies for poor profitability last decade, but it has been absolutely a blessing for consumers, not just in the US, by the way, around the world, where 70% of global oil supply came from primarily Texas and North Dakota, the core shale plays. 70%. And when you add in Canadian oil sands growth, you may be up to 75% of global energy supply came from mostly Texas, a little bit from North Dakota, some contribution from the province of Alberta. And we have allowed not just US consumers to benefit, but the world to benefit from our very inexpensive energy. It was bad for profitability for oil and gas companies, but very good for the global consumer. Since then, I think it's a big risk for people who say, you know what, we need to get off oil and gas. It's fine if you believe it. Why would you want to get off American oil and gas first? This should be the last barrels produced. I think it's going to be 100 years from now. But even if you're someone who thinks it's going to be sooner, the last barrel should be produced, should come from America, and I will say also Canada. It's been the driver of global oil supply, and we really run the risk of that supply shifting from US and Canada to some of the OPEC countries, to countries like Russia. To whatever one's view of it is, I can't believe as an American, you would want the supply to shift to these other places.
And there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? I mean, one, just being from America, we want it to come from America. So that's number one, right? It's better for our economy. So that's an obvious reason why you'd say that. But there's other reasons too, right? I mean, is it just, it's cleaner? Our processes are cleaner. Environmental regulations surrounding extraction is certainly cleaner and better for the environment. Are there other reasons too that I'm not taking into account?
I mean, the number one reason would be is it provides jobs for American workers. And some of these are oil executives, but far many more of them are blue collar workers who work in the oil field. And these are good paying jobs. You do not necessarily have to go to college for all these jobs. So some people want to go to college, some don't. These are jobs that I don't know why you wouldn't want to have them in America. When you have the jobs, you also have tax revenues that come from those jobs. You have the spillover effects of other industries, and maybe it's restaurant industry, maybe it's automobile industry, also benefiting from those workers, both making money and spending money and commuting to work and so forth. It is a huge jobs and tax benefit to our country to have American oil and gas being put to work.
Well, I mean, obviously I agree with that. I mean, that was my first reason too. And most of my neighbors here are employed by that very industry. So that's rather obvious. Here's the thing. I'm going to make that argument to people who really don't care about that. And most environmentalists, lefty types, they don't care about that. And most Democrats don't care about that. What they'll say is, well, that's true, but there's just as many. Look at the highest job growth is in the solar and wind sector. That's what they'll say. We can get them other jobs, better jobs, greener jobs. That's what they'll say. So they don't care about that. And there's no, I mean, they are incorrect. And like, I can show you the data of how much those jobs pay versus oil and gas. I can show you that there's simply less total jobs, even though they're quickly growing. They're still on an absolute value scale, way, way less of them. So I can show you, I can debunk their argument. That's not the point. The point is they don't care. Like they will not care about those facts. And so I have another. So that's why I look at the cleaner energy one. Like, you can look at studies that show that a barrel of oil produced here or a unit of natural gas produced by us is just simply cleaner for the environment on a lifetime basis than Russian. So that one's more convincing to them. My question for you is more, am I missing something else as far as, like, I don't know, the global, like the stability of the global markets, if it comes from the US just being a country with two oceans on either side? And is there some value in that we should also promote?
I mean, there's no question there's huge value in that. And listen, on the jobs, if people want to work in the other industries, that is fine. The idea that we have to choose between one form of energy or another, I mean, I will say energy should not be a partisan issue. We should want all forms of energy. But when 80% of our energy comes from oil, natural gas, and coal, I'm talking globally now, it's not dissimilar in the US. We should make sure we don't cut off this traditional energy when there's lots of issues with the new stuff that you have highlighted. Yeah. U.S. shale supply was 70% of global oil demand. So we've gone from being a huge net oil importer to being inclusive of Canada, somewhat balanced. We no longer are dependent on the OPEC countries or Russia or so forth for our oil supply, but we also benefit the rest of the world. And so when we look at economic growth of developing parts of the world, they clearly benefit from America having contributed as much as it has to global supply. And if you start cutting that off, if you say, all I care about is climate, and I want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I don't understand how cutting off American oil supply helps to that goal. No oil company anywhere in the world created a single product that actually combusts oil and gas, if that is something that you care about. But the idea that these billions of people in the rest of the world should be left for themselves, when we can actually benefit both our country and the health of the global economy by producing our oil and gas, that to me should be foundational to the energy discussion.
So going back to just the health of the energy market right now, can you help us understand the cyclical nature of the oil and gas sector and what you refer to as super cycle? What do you mean by that? What is that? Or where are we in that super cycle?
Part of it is the cycles are very long term. So I mentioned the decade of poor profitability. That was preceded by a decade of very good profitability. And that's sort of the nature of these businesses. Profits are good, people overinvest, maybe demand takes a hit, and you go through a down cycle. But the down cycles are not 1 or 2 years. They tend to be decade type length and duration. And so we're just recovering from that. We may be in year 2, maybe year 3 of a recovery period. But unlike past recoveries, you're now getting politicians, environmentalists, some of which you've alluded to, saying, well, we don't want to invest this go round. And it's something that's very hard to understand. You can be the biggest proponent for transitioning or using newer forms of energy, that's fine. But the idea that you want to cut off what is, again, still 80% of our energy mix before the new stuff is here, if it will ever be here, but certainly before it is actually here, is the part that is probably going to cause this cycle to go on longer, be more volatile, lead to more inflation, than if we just allowed the markets to have their normal type of response to better profits. Better profits should motivate investors to want to support the sector more, to invest more. And we're still seeing a disconnect where the profits have gotten better, but because of all this uncertainty and are we going to transition or not, there's been a kind of a restraint to the capital spending side of things.
Yeah, and you said something earlier where we shouldn't have to choose between energy sources, and that's especially true when you have increasing demand. I mean, drastically increasing global demand. So it does blow our minds when we're when especially Democrats and your more radical environmentalist types, they argue for closing of plants, but you'll replace it with an equal amount of energy output from a solar or wind farm. And first of all, it's never equal because it's variable. But second of all, you need both, right? Like you should be adding on to the grid because we're in a constant state. It seems worldwide. This seems to be a problem. I'm not sure anybody has gotten it perfectly right. Where we are just barely keeping our heads above water with respect to meeting demand with the supply that we've got, and that's a real problem. So it should seem obvious that you'd be for an all of the above. Can you give us a primer on OPEC and how powerful it used to be, how powerful it is now? Again, maybe another reason you want America to be a leader in energy is because we're not OPEC. We don't just arbitrarily decide how much supply to put out on the market just to keep prices high and therefore profits high for us. I mean, that's what the Saudis do constantly, and frustrated. And also, what would you say about their even though they're technically our ally, how often do you think that they throttle their supply and exports in order to try and apply pressure to their competition, in West Texas?
Well, so OPEC's about 35 to 40% of world oil supply. What has really transformed us is we used to be very dependent on them. I'm in my 50s, and I can remember waiting in the gas lines when we had the Arab oil embargoes in the 1970s. And then thanks to really the shale revolution, we've gone from being huge oil importers to basically being balanced and therefore no longer is dependent on OPEC. So at least for our country, the relevance of OPEC has diminished. I will say these countries usually overstate their ability to deliver production. I think it results in geopolitical influence accruing to them that I'm not sure is fully deserved. But what I would say is that any country, whether it's the United States or any country in the world, why would you want to be dependent on countries that may not have your interest at heart? And so this idea that we should somehow restrict or somehow lessen American oil and gas supply and therefore again become dependent on them like we were in the 70s, it's just a very hard mindset to understand. I think that's going to be the challenge going forward, to resist this push to restrict our oil and gas supply.
Well, one of the accusations you hear, especially recently, when all of our big five oil companies are finally making profits after 10 years of not making profits and losing a ton of money in 2020, which is of course what they point out. They're like, yeah, we made 40 billion in profits last year. We lost 40 billion. So what do you want? The math ends up to what it ends up to. How big are these oil giants? Your Exxons and your Shells, and compared to say like Saudi Aramco? What's the comparison there?
I mean, so big oil used to be half of global oil supply. I now call them medium oil because they're down to like 5% of global oil supply. So they're nowhere near as big as they used to be. They're still large companies. They're meaningful portions of like the stock market or what have you. But in terms of global oil supply, they're low to mid single digit. And so it's easy for politicians to pick on them. I get it. I will just say it's kind of irrelevant. I'd argue it's cynical. I think they know that they're not as important as they once was. No oil company, by the way, in the United States owns their gas stations anymore. That ended a long time ago. So the idea that they're price gouging, you're really accusing mom and pop people who own these gas stations and some larger chains of price gouging, since oil companies don't actually own their gas stations anymore. So it all seems like a bunch of, and they've of course been investigated many times over many different Congresses and so forth. And there's never any evidence of the price gouging, but they're generally a much smaller portion of global oil markets than they used to be. The shale industry has become meaningful, but quote, big oil, they're really not so big anymore.
But the shale industry is made up of hundreds, thousands. Of medium-sized and smaller companies. Yeah,
thousands
that's interesting.
Of company, many in Texas, in your home state. And again, we should all be thankful for the contributions they've made to the health of this country. There's no question about that.
And so, how do you how do you see the future in investments in oil and gas, given just this the obsession with the transition to renewables, and again, where are the biggest obstacles to that investment coming from? Obviously, there's the history of bad profits. What kind of role does ESG play in this?
Go ahead. Sorry. So the profits are getting better, and again, normally you'd get therefore a capex cycle spending or investment to follow that. I think the biggest bottleneck and the biggest risk we see are around infrastructure. So oil and gas companies do need pipelines. We need pipelines out of Canada. We need pipelines within our country, and especially if they're interstate between states. You have the federal government that basically says yay or nay to these things, and especially if they're across Canada to the U.S. as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And so infrastructure is where they need the biggest help, or at least if you don't want to help, it's fine. Just don't block them. Don't allow environmentalists and others to block the infrastructure. Yeah. I think that's going to be the biggest issue going forward is, our projects, do they get the permitting? Do they get approvals? Right. And we've signed, that's where I'd worry. I think from an investor standpoint, as the profits come back, you will see a recognition, hey, oil and gas isn't going away anytime soon. They'll be supportive, but they need things to not be blocked, basically.
Well, so we saw the debt ceiling negotiation pass. One of the reasons that was smart. There was a lot of reasons that was smart to vote for, namely because you didn't have another choice. You got a yes or no vote. A lot of people like to pretend that there's other options, and there's an entire political philosophy, especially in kind of your hyper right wing, where there's a belief system where you actually have many options when you vote, and turns out you don't. You have a yes or no vote. So that's one reason. But the other reason that a lot of people got to yes was because of NEPA reform, the National Environmental Protection Act, which governs the permitting process for environmental reviews and such. And that was a pretty big policy win. The sector was over the moon about it. The sector meaning construction, infrastructure, oil and gas, everybody, and including renewables. If you want to build renewables, if you want to build more transmission lines to get your solar power to a city, well, you got to have an environmental permitting process that isn't insane. And so we feel like that's a really big win. Is there any indication that investors feel the same so far?
I think the debt ceiling negotiation that did contribute, like there's a long way to go on NEPA reform. So it's never one reform. And whether it's 60 or 70 different instances where you're going to need states, you're going to need federal government, but that whole sort of quote permanent reform, that was a good start, the debt ceiling negotiation. And hopefully it's the first step of many. And by the way, everybody should benefit from this, even for proponents of quote renewables and so forth. They've faced they're starting to recognize the environmental movement actually includes them in terms of opposing their permits and so forth. So there is massive permit reform that is needed. And honestly, it's really hard to understand how the opposition is allowed to block this type of infrastructure. It's baffling, actually.
Yeah, no, we've let them weaponize the court system massively. Okay, so I mean, you didn't answer my question, but you haven't seen this obvious change, and I'm not sure you would. It's only been like a couple of weeks, so. But I'm just kind of.
I'm sorry. It's too soon to know. It's too soon to know whether that is going to stimulate it. Again, I think there's many more steps that are needed, so that's a good first step.
Yeah, well, it's something. I mean, and a lot of it is just signaling. I mean, over the last couple of years, we look at why there's been a chilling effect on investment in the oil and gas sector without any actual policy changes. And there's something little here and there, but from this administration, but it's mostly proposing rules from the EPA that are just crazy. Yeah. And without even having implemented it yet, it has its own kind of chilling effect. So, like from the politics side, what we see, and I'm curious if you agree with this, that it's often rhetoric matters. Signaling matters. It's nice if you can get some really hardcore changes to law, but a lot of times it's just like letting industry know that you're not going to try and screw them in the next 10, 20 years. Like that, sometimes that simple message is enough. And they get that message from the Republicans. They don't get that message from Democrats. And so, if you've got $1 million to invest somewhere, it is a safer investment to invest in a wind farm, which is highly subsidized and was a guaranteed a return because the government makes it so.
There's no question the rhetoric matters. And I don't understand the anti-rhetoric against American oil and gas companies. I mean, people don't want to like the oil industry; they don't have to, but it's a global industry, and the OPEC members are huge portions of it. Russia's a huge portion of the global oil supply. Why would you be against American oil and gas companies, even if you're not inherently a fan of it? It's that part of the rhetoric that's very hard to understand. So,
well, you made an argument that the U.S. and Canada could potentially displace 10 million barrels of oil a day of Russian and Iranian oil by 2030. So how do we really have that much untapped capacity?
Yeah, so the math, and I did this about 2 years ago, so we'll probably have to push that out 2 years since we're not on track for it. But if you allowed US supply to grow 500,000 barrels a day, that's about the rate it's grown at. Though there's some concerns that when you look at the controversy over trying to get Alaska developed, which last time I checked was part of the United States, so should be, quote, good oil, some of the pipeline and infrastructure bottlenecks in shale, we should have a goal to perpetuate 500,000 barrels a day of supply growth. Canada, it would double their growth rate. That requires pipelines from Canada to be allowed into our country. That's been blocked by various administrations historically. That alone will get over 10 years.
500,000 a day. Wait, 500,000 a day per year.
Per year, exactly.
Okay. I was like, wow, 500,000 more barrels per day.
So the shale is starting to mature, which is why you need places like the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska and continued shale to be motivated. Some of it's the rhetoric, some of it's encouraging companies to do this. There's going to be some encouragement that's needed and some permitting and other reform that's needed. Canada grows, and then there is the potential to have some sort of fuel efficiency gains that we've not really done as a country in a long, long time. And between these three areas, Canada, the US, and fuel economy, we're probably going to choose not to. 10 million barrels a day of export growth, which, by the way, equals Russia plus Iranian supply. So again, for anyone who hates the oil industry, go ahead, hate them. You're telling me you like Russia and Iran better? There's no way that makes sense for America. Let's have it come here and have it come from Canada.
Yeah. And that's what I tell people. Like, you're going to get the oil no matter what. Like, because the world needs it, and Africa needs it, and India needs it. Like, I don't care what you say. You're going to get it from somewhere, and it's going to be in the atmosphere that we all share. So, just given this hard fact, like, you should support American gas. Well, what kind of, so that growth is possible just based on the economics of it if we get out of its way. What kind of studies are there on actually how much we have in the ground? How many hundreds of years of supply do we have, and what's the latest on that? I'm not actually very familiar.
I mean, people have been worried about running out of oil almost since the industry's founding in the late 1800s, and so you can actually have these great magazine covers. I encourage people, actually, Representative, you should go to the Petroleum Museum in Midland, Texas. It is an awesome museum.
I do need to go there.
They'll have the magazine covers going back to the 1920s. Is the end of oil here? Is the end of oil near? And I think we're not anywhere close to running out of oil and natural gas. And we're very blessed as a country to have sizable resources of oil, natural gas, and actually coal, the latter of which we're not really developing anymore. There's no reason we shouldn't be using all of it for as long as we can, and then helping the developing world. It makes us stronger to help the developing world develop their economies. India, you mentioned, Africa are two places that come to mind.
Okay, so this is a question I have for you. You seem like the right guy to ask this question to. So an argument I always make is that 50% of global emissions from power production come from coal, foreign coal, not counting US. We use so little coal comparatively now. It's foreign, 50% foreign coal. Most of that's from China, India. So that's a lot of emissions. That's if you're trying to make a big dent in emissions, because this is, you're on a crusade to save Gaia, Mother Earth, and all that. Fine, I'm with you. It's great. But if that's your crusade, then you got to think then, okay, as a problem solver, what's the easiest way to displace that emission output? And the obvious answer is with gas, right? It's about half the emissions of coal, still has emissions. It's more emissions than nuclear. It's more emissions than solar and wind. But we're just talking, we also have to work within the confines of reality and, what works in a country and whatever, and what's cheap and what's available and all this. So gas is the most obvious one. How easy would it be? Like, so if President Biden finally woke up from his slumber and said, you know what, like, God, we got to do that. We need to have a natural gas Marshall Plan to displace foreign coal. Like, that's our number one goal. Is that even possible? How would that work? without the government intervention, just, with private sector, if we go to India and we're like, can you just take our gas instead of using coal? What are the price points? Like, how does that business conversation go, first of all? And then what would we need to do as a country to actually make it happen?
For a lot of these developing countries like China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, coal is going to be the cheapest, and they're going to use it because that is a domestic resource. They don't have to import it. When you look at the world,
so there's no business argument. Like, there's no way that like my shale folks here in Texas could go to them and make them an offer they can't refuse. It's just not, just from a price perspective, it's not possible.
I don't think you'll displace their domestic coal, but what we will do is help them meet their extra energy needs. So some of them burn oil for power generation. Sure. Some of them burn nothing. There's 1 billion people who have to burn biomass and, cow dung and so forth. So for those folks, and by the way, for Europe, whatever we think of Europe, they are now hugely dependent on our LNG exports. And this is where pipelines are most needed. So Appalachia, the Marcellus Shale, it is landlocked in the middle of Pennsylvania, and you need to cross straight lines. And there's been huge environmental opposition to new pipelines out of Appalachia, out of Ohio, and in the Utica Shale. Let's get these to either the Gulf Coast or the East Coast for export, probably first to Europe, but also to help the developing world meet their energy needs beyond the coal that I think they're going to keep using for the foreseeable future. So our coal industry has shrunk to almost nothing for a variety of reasons. China is now half the world's coal demand, and it is going to still grow, and it's going to grow for the foreseeable future because why? People need energy, right? They need energy first.
And I'm having this conversation from the perspective of like a climate debate, right? I'm like, okay, like, it's a climate debate. So then what would the U.S. government have to do? Is it, it would have to happen at that level. Like, it can't happen at the private sector level for the reasons you just stated. It's for them, it's just too obviously cheap and plentiful right there at home to take take imports of natural gas to refit that coal plant into a natural gas plant. Like, they just won't do it unless the government makes them, and I guess my point to climate activists is like, you want the government to make us do a lot of things and spend money on a lot of things that won't even work. So if you're going to make governments do things, make China take our natural gas and displace their coal, but that would take a government to government negotiation.
It would. And when you think about it, look at China's using coal. Why aren't they using solar and wind? I mean, don't cheap solar panels come from China? Yet they're choosing to export their forced labor solar panels to the rest of the world, such as the US and Europe, while they're burning more coal because coal's reliable and it's affordable and it's available every single day, not, occasionally. And it is mystifying why that is not so obvious to people that China's burning coal. They're growing some amount of solar, but overwhelmingly they're growing their power generation mix with coal, and so yes, it would take government to government type solutions to try and get them off coal, and LNG would be one of the solutions.
Yeah, I mean, Germany's restarted their coal production. They're some of the dirtiest coal production, right? Lignite. They when they say biofuels, they say that's zero carbon, but I think it's like double the carbon emissions of natural gas. They're burning wood. That's what they mean by biofuels. And, it's all a shell game, I think. What do you do write some interesting things about the future of coal, the industry in general around. I mean, it's not so great. It's almost dead in the US, but around the world, it's growing. It's a growing market. And so why? I mean, despite all of every World Bank and UN summit climate summit telling them that they can't burn coal, it continues to grow. So, and it's for the economic reasons you stated earlier, I think, right?
I mean, it's for the number one reason. People need energy. You cannot live a modern life without any form. And honestly, you're not going to care what it's from. No citizen cares whether it's solar, oil, or gas, or nuclear, what have you. They just need energy. They need it today. Right. Hopefully it's affordable. But frankly, you'd pay anything to have energy. You can't go without it for 5 minutes. Nobody can, right? And so they use coal because that's what they have. And then they're not dependent on OPEC, and they're not dependent on foreign producers and so forth. I think maybe we'll get to the nuclear question. For folks who truly do care about decarbonizing, they believe that that's a major priority, it's very hard to understand, if they're so serious about it, how nuclear is not a more major part of the conversation. Here you now have baseload supply, meaning it runs 24/7, 365 with zero carbon. Now it's more expensive, but it actually works. And that's important to people.
It is more, yeah. That's why I think you've written about this. There needs to be a kind of a nuclear Marshall Plan of some sorts, where you make it a lot less expensive when you decide that you're going to invest and it's going to scale, and you're going to do it in this sort of modular way that you can scale it at much better than we have in the past. It would, yeah. I mean, that giant, $1 trillion or $500 billion investment into renewables that came from the Inflation Reduction Act. You could have gotten so much more bang for your buck if you just said that was all for nuclear. That was the entire thing was for nuclear and investment in that. And like I said, it'll last forever. I do hit that.
This is a really important point you're making. If you actually redirected all those subsidies and all the subsidies that are going to come to nuclear, you might actually start having a solution where people had energy availability, affordability with reliability and with lower carbon intensity. It's a great suggestion. Whatever people think, that's a good suggestion that you just came up with. Redirect all of it towards nuclear.
Yeah, it's everybody agrees with that, except the climate activists for some odd reason. There's a weird obsession with solar and wind that I've never been able to understand. It's like they've almost deified those things. This is interesting. You've written about, and I'm not too familiar with it, so I want to ask you about the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and you write it poses a financing risk to traditional energy companies in the United States, Europe, and Canada. It, along with the International Energy Agency and World Bank, pose a bigger risk to financing energy supply growth for the rest of the world. Steps to limit fossil fuel financing will be detrimental to economic growth in the developing world. So what do they have to do with? How do they threaten the fossil fuel financing? And this is the World Bank, right? I thought the entire point of their existence was to help people come out of poverty. So
there's been a lot of focus on the ESG issue, and I think you did ask it before. We can always come back to it. To me, it's a sideshow. The bigger risk is this is a group led by Mark Carney, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and what they're trying to do is to get basically U.S. and European banks to come up with an emissions finance target and ultimately to take that to zero, which I'll shorthand it is to say, we want by some year your financing, this is both capital markets, bank financing, as well as insurance, to go to zero. And what does that mean? Do they finance Russian oil and gas companies? Do they insure Iranian oil companies? No, we're talking about American, Canadian, and U.S. oil and gas companies, primarily from these organizations. And the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and there's some other umbrella organizations, they're trying to convince the major capital markets providers, all the banks you've heard of, the JP Morgans, Goldman Sachs's of the world, to have a target to take that financing and to take that insurance to zero. And you've seen folks, primarily in Europe, companies like Munich Re and Swiss Re, which are big insurers, say, we're going to not finance new oil and gas projects. Whose projects? It's going to be American and European and Canadian projects. It actually, to me, is the biggest risk to the financing of this sector, more so than all the talk about profitability, more so, frankly, than any environmentalist activity to like block pipelines and that kind of stuff, which I'm against. This is a real risk, and it's insidious. It's not high profile. It's not right?
Would I classify this Glasgow index as ESG? What you said something was a sideshow. Like which part was a sideshow?
I will just say the sort of individual investor reactions of sort of XYZ fund has said, we're not going to invest in oil and gas or what have you. Okay. That's fine. There's just so many different investors out there. Yeah. To me, there's sort of it's not the issue. This umbrella
they don't have this like influence.
There's thousands of investors. If one or two or like 10 or even 100 don't invest, it doesn't matter.
Is BlackRock in that? Yeah. Is BlackRock in that category? Like, is that a boogeyman that we're like too focused on, and we should be focused on things like this Glasgow Financial Alliance?
That's exactly the point. I do think BlackRock's become a boogeyman, and it's easy to pick on Mr. Fink and so forth. But I will say this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, telling the 10 major banks and the 10 major insurance companies, which matter a lot, you should stop financing this sector. That to me is a huge, huge risk. And I will say, I will credit the Republican attorney generals who sued the insurance companies. And as a result, you've seen the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, one of these subsidiary alliances, it's actually disbanded. And it's a start. We need the World Bank goes with this. The World Bank telling the developing world, you don't get to have coal and you don't get to have natural gas, even though Germany, as you correctly mentioned, is using more coal right now. It's impossible to understand the logic behind that. why does the developing world not get to use the same products that Europe's using right now and being told by Europeans, of all people, they don't get to do it? It is absolutely outrageous. And I wish there was more focus on the World Bank and Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero than sort of the volleying back and forth about some of the funds out there like BlackRock and so forth.
Well, that's good information, because obviously I've heard of the World Bank. But I guess I wasn't as focused on the World Bank either. You know, I kind of knew BlackRock was a bit of a boogeyman. I don't like what I've also seen them reverse some of their comments. I also just happen to know how much they actually invest in oil and gas. It's a lot. I mean, they have entire portfolios there. So I've always been a little confused about what's really going on, what isn't.
They are huge oil and gas investors. They actually got a lot of really knowledgeable oil and gas portfolio managers and analysts.
Yeah.
So I am personally, I will admit, I hate to say a fan of BlackRock, but I do think they've been sort of maligned based on one letter that Larry Fink wrote that I think people took issue with. That probably wasn't a great letter, and it has since been updated and adjusted. So I have no problem with that. But what about the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and these alliances?
You never hear that. You never hear that. And it's like, hey guys, you know, if we're gonna, and all, just a message to all, you know, our conspiratorial media outlets on the right that love boogeymen. This is your boogeyman. This is the one you're supposed to love. Like, well, according to them, I'm a globalist in their little boogeyman book. I mean, that's how dumb it can get. But you know, this is what frustrates me about politics, is the truth doesn't get out there. And look at him, like I didn't really know about this to this extent, I think, until you started talking about it. So that is good information. I mean, okay, but how do we attack them? I mean, so we did a good job with some Republican attorney generals, kind of dismantling their alliance here in the U.S. What would be my next step if I wanted to make this my crusade against the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANs? I think is that what they call themselves? GFANs?
I think they do use the GFANs acronym, and I'd just say in the same way, all the sort of focus that goes to the investor managers like BlackRock, if it was just simply redirected to how awful these financial alliance for net zero umbrella organizations are, and just to highlight who are they going after? They're going after U.S. banks and European banks who finance who? U.S. and European oil and gas companies. How does that help anyone anywhere in the world? And certainly not, in our case, Americans, or in Europe's case, Europeans. And so it's about redirecting the fire to these types of organizations.
But the question is, what is the fire? You know, and is the fire doing a podcast about it? Is the fire me doing a post about it? You know, that's my messaging fire. As Republicans and just generally, you know, limited government advocates, we always find ourselves in these positions. All right, what's the right balance here? Because you have private companies potentially doing severe damage to the public good. But in the end, you know, they are making investment decisions with their money. Like in the end, that's what they're doing. In the end, there's a freedom of association principle here, which I can't extract myself from. Like, because I believe very deeply in my freedom to associate with whoever I want, hire whoever I want, fire whoever I want, admit whoever I want into my school or my club. Like, freedom of association is paramount. Now we've left to an extent, we've left that principle behind just by nature of having anti-discrimination laws. You know, we needed anti-discrimination laws at a certain point in our history. I don't know that we need them now, but we definitely needed them to right wrongs. And so this becomes a very complicated philosophical conversation. It's the same conversation with respect to, you know, how social media companies do their thing. I mean, it's their platform. Why can't they take off my video if they don't like it? You know, and so this is the conversation we're always having. So you know, and one of the ways we've thought about dealing with it with respect to big tech is it's through anti-discrimination law and adding political views to that list, right? You can't discriminate based on race, sex, et cetera, religion, or political affiliation. Hard to prove, but still, at least it makes them think twice before just deplatforming you. Is that the same approach we would take with banks who don't want to lend to certain people? Are they engaged, you know, where via the law and via our own, you know, and in accordance with our own set of principles? How do we actually go about tackling that?
I mean, I think the way the Insurance Alliance came about was through antitrust and saying you're essentially de facto agreeing to collectively not, insure this group of companies. It's discriminatory, it's collusion, it's all these kind of things. And that's, you know, I'm not a lawyer, right? So, but I believe that was the successful attack on the insurance agencies. I will say there's these sort of global organizations where the leader of GFANZ, the leader of the International Energy Agency, the leader of the UN for that matter. These are not elected people where, okay, someone voted for these people. You may not like them, but there'll be election in 4 years. And the impact they're having collectively, it's very under the radar. People like energy geeks like myself understand it, but I don't blame the American people broadly for not understanding it. But
they're obsessed with like, well, what's like the World Economic Forum? Is that another one? Because that one gets plenty of attention. I know, because they're always accusing me of being like a card carrying secret member of the World Economic Forum. It's the dumbest freaking thing ever. But I'm always I have certain supporters who will text me all the time. Did you see what they did? They had another meeting. They did and I'm like, what are they doing though? I'm not sure they're doing anything. GFAN, this sounds different. What you're talking about, this alliance sounds like they have very specific things they're doing. What is your opinion on the World Economic Forum and their actual power to move us towards this horrible left-wing utopia, which is kind of what they want?
I mean, I agree with it. I think the World Economic Forum has probably become a bit of a boogeyman and a bit of a punching bag and these kind of things. But on the other hand, this idea of sort of there is an accepted viewpoint, and that anything that counters that accepted viewpoint is, quote, denialism or misinformation. And I think that's where there are real issues. And so, this idea that, again, if I take the GFANZ example, that every bank has to agree that limiting financing of oil and gas companies, as opposed to, hey, I'm a bank, is this a good risk or not? Is this a profitable portfolio of loans or is it not? That should be the normal way banks decide who to finance, not, oh, we're all going to agree to just stop financing this industry irrespective of the business risks because some umbrella organization has decided this is how to fight, quote, climate change. That's the problematic part.
Yeah. And when you talk about the ESG, would you say GFANZ is under this kind of ESG movement? I call ESG a movement because it's hard to pin down. It's not like it's a set of policies. It's a bit of a ideology that's pervasive throughout the private sector, and in its most harmless form, I suppose it's just a set of ratings about what a company does, and as an investor, I guess you want to know that. That's fine. But in a more nefarious form, it puts a lot of pressure, and it gains influence, creates this billion-dollar industry to create these rating systems that put pressure on companies to do things that whatever woke activists want them to do, not just with energy, but I mean with defense, encouraging companies that you really shouldn't be doing defense because, people die because of weapons. And it's like, well, that's my entire business. Like, what do you just, you're going to try and screw my investment scores because of that? I mean, so what's your general opinion on that?
Congressman, I actually think you just did a great job of articulating how it originally went from stuff that any investor will focus on. So part of ESG is governance. Does it matter if a country owns a company or one rich person does? And is that good or bad for how the company goes about its business? Or, do they not take safety spending carefully so the plant may blow up? Like, that's the traditional way that investors kind of thought about these metrics. It's now, though, taken off a life form. It's become more insidious. It's become virtue signaling, and it's become to the point where there is a, quote, agreed view of what a company should do and what it should not do, defined by, of course, only some small set of people. Maybe that gets back to the World Economic Forum discussion we were having, and these global elites that kind of know what's best for all of us. Boy, we know how to tackle climate change and we know how to provide the energy for you. So here's the agreed way to do it. We're all going to agree to have this much solar and wind, and we're all going to agree to stop financing oil and gas, as if they know what's best. That's where ESG and these issues have gone in the completely wrong direction. And it is that portion of ESG that needs massive pushback. And so there's a fundamental way to evaluate a company that does take some of these things into account. There is the virtue signaling part, or the part that says, well, we know what's best for society at large, where the pushback needs to happen. And that is where I'm happy to be on here with you. We both mentioned ClearPath. We need more conservative voices in this energy and climate discussion. Because the idea that government knows best, or that small group of global elites know what best, we know that's not accurate. We need markets, we need technology, and we need some set of rules, but ultimately innovation, technology to get us to a better energy future.
And we need to know where to aim our fire. I often say Democrat voters want to win and Republican voters want to be entertained. And so we're very much more inclined to get attached to these boogeymen. I guess the left is too. I mean, Trump is like their ultimate boogeyman, right? And so they just obsess over it. And that makes them, that creates weaknesses. but we do it a lot more. And whether it's BlackRock or these days it's Bud Light or Disney or, I mean, it's not like there's not problems here, but I'm like, people are like, what are you doing to stop the World Economic Forum? What do you mean stop? There are a bunch of weirdos, far leftists that meet and they say crazy things. I get it. They say crazy things. But I don't know if you noticed this, but there's an entire political party that agrees with those crazy things, and they're winning elections in America. They're called the Democrat Party. So maybe you should stop sending me the damn articles about the World Economic Forum every 5 minutes and maybe talk about what you're doing to beat a Democrat in an election, because that's what actually matters, because they're the ones because that is the political party that is an embodiment of the philosophy that the World Economic Forum promotes that you're so afraid of. But people love these like kind of dark, mysterious globalist institutions. And I'm like, geez, man, like it's all about how many doors you knocked on this week. That's what it's actually about. Like put your energy towards something productive that you can actually affect. There aren't any Republicans that think that agree with the principles of the World Economic Forum or GFANS. There's a lot of Democrats who do. So get your ass out there and actually do some work. I mean, that's my message. That's my message to the public. Like when it comes to that, because I'm always very candid about what is actually necessary. And
it's a good message. It's why I started a Substack. I feel like energy is something I know something about. And so when people say, hey, there's a quote climate crisis, and the only way to solve the climate crisis somehow is to stop investing in American oil and gas, as if that's going to make any difference to anything. And then people believe in it. And as you just said, they vote for it. And so there is a responsibility, there is a need for Republicans, for conservatives, whatever you want to say, to come up with what is actually the I'm going to say truths, that we need American oil and gas, and that eliminating oil and gas is not going to change our climate trajectory one iota. Never mind, you can question some of the climate crisis language in the first place. We should actually talk about all this stuff. So
one of the reasons we do this podcast, the way I do it, is because if you listen to it, you're going to learn arguments. You're going to learn the correct factual arguments. But then you got to do something with those factual arguments, and focusing on random unsolvable problems just because it's entertaining is not doing something productive with the knowledge. You got to go door to door. You got to win elections, and then when you win those elections, well, then you can figure out what legislation you need to pass to prevent banks from discriminating against the energy companies that will save our lives. There's like a sequence of events to this. And so again, learning where to aim our fire and aim our passion and our activity, like that's super important. And again, that's why I like you pointing out this GFANS thing. It's honestly not something most people have really heard about, but they're a good example of like an effective organization. Like I don't understand if the World Economic Forum is even that effective, because they're kind of just all over the place. They focus on a million different things. They're like just a progressive think tank, just like we have.
It's a networking event now. Rich people go there to hobnob with other rich people.
Yeah, it's become an obsession within the conservative, your kind of conservative voters is an obsession. And I'm like, what are they even doing? I don't know, But these guys, GFANS, meanwhile, has a very specific mission, and it's actually very effective. And so you got to pay attention to what the enemy is doing and how to effectively counter it. Thank you for pointing that out to us. I think it's useful. I think it's useful. All right, let's wrap up here. What else? With concern to this with this subject, do we miss anything in particular that we want to wrap up with?
I mean, I'd just say that Republicans are and should be for clean air, clean water, biodiversity, and these kind of things. And it's not about being against any form of energy, but it's being actually factual and truthful about why we need American oil and gas. There is a role for solar and wind to play, but it is not the be all and end all. And somehow people are going to think it's going to be some massive portion of our energy mix. We need more nuclear. We need jobs here. And we need innovation. We need technology development. These are the kind of things that are going to allow us to have jobs, taxes, revenues, economic growth for all. But with cleaner air, clean water, and biodiversity, there's nothing wrong. We should actually have those types of objectives, but let's have the conservative principles that go with it, and not think a big government approach, this global elite approach, is what's going to get us there. That they know what's best. We know that doesn't work through history, and it would be my sort of closing message for this.
Yeah. Totally agree. I always say you can have your cake and eat it too with respect to the climate and energy conversation. You can have a cleaner environment with also energy security, and but to sacrifice energy security would be to literally sacrifice people, and like that can't be on the table unless you're an anti-humanist radical environmentalist, which unfortunately is a key part of that, of the more extreme parts of that movement. They are truly anti-human. And we are for human flourishing, and human flourishing does mean conserving our environment. But you can do both. You can. That was great. Appreciate the conversation.
Congressman, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
All right. Arjun Murti, thank you so much.